She chose the piece of land that every man at the territorial office had refused. They watched her sign her name on the parcel they had walked past, with pity in their eyes, and one of them, a broad-shouldered farmer from Iowa, leaned toward the land agent and said quietly that the Tennessee widow had just bought herself a grave on the prairie. The agent, Silas Mercer, did not answer. He had taken her filing fee, initialed her claim, and watched her walk back to a wagon that held everything she owned in the world. A trunk of her dead husband's surveying tools. A 12-year-old boy with his father's serious eyes. And a folded map that no one else in Cass County knew existed. 5 years later, that piece of land would be worth more than any farm within 40 miles of it. 5 years later, the men who had pitied her would walk to her door, hats in their hands, and ask her to teach them what she had seen in those contour lines that they had missed entirely. But before any of that, there would be a poisoned well in the middle of the night. There would be a barn that almost burned. There would be a man in a black coat who arrived with an offer no widow was supposed to refuse. Her name was Marlena Thatcher, and the ground she chose had been waiting for her a very long time. The train carried Marlena Thatcher north out of Tennessee on the second morning of April in 1884, and she watched the country she had been born into slide away from her through a window streaked with the rain of 2 states. She was 38 years old. Her hands rested folded in her lap with the particular stillness of hands that had learned over many seasons that activity does not always equal accomplishment, and that sometimes the most useful thing a person can do is sit and think while the world rearranges itself around them. On the seat beside her, her son, Eli, was asleep with his head against her shoulder, his 12-year-old body still small enough to fit against her in the way he had fit when he was 4 and 6 and 8. Though she could feel in the heaviness of him the boy he was becoming, the man he would be, and she thought about that as the rain hit the window and the fields outside turned into Kentucky, and then into Indiana, and then into Illinois. She had been on the train for 3 days. The trunk in the baggage car held everything that mattered. Her husband Jeremiah's surveying tools wrapped in oilcloth, the brass theodolite he had built himself from parts he had ordered piece by piece over 4 years from a supplier in Chattanooga. His leather-bound journal with 12 growing seasons of weather notes and soil observations recorded in his careful, upright hand. A canvas sack of soil samples from the bottomland of their farm in Sevier County, Tennessee, taken with a small auger in the autumn before he died. Sealed in tin tobacco cans labeled in pencil with the date and the depth and the location each sample had come from. A folded map hand-drawn on heavy paper that she had not yet shown to Eli and would not show to him for some time yet. And a letter, sealed, addressed to her, written by Jeremiah 3 weeks before the lung sickness took him in the dark, cold heart of January 1882, and given to her on the last day he could still hold a pen with the instruction that she was not to open it until she had reached the place she was going. She had not opened it. The conductor came through the car and called for the next stop, and Marlena straightened slightly and touched Eli's shoulder. And he woke the way boys his age woke all at once, with the alertness of someone who had been pretending sleep for the last 20 minutes anyway. He looked at her with his father's eyes, that same quality of careful watching she had seen across the breakfast table for 12 years. And she felt the small, familiar ache that had become a daily presence in her chest since the winter. Jeremiah died, and she gave the boy a small nod that meant the same thing it had meant for 2 years now, which was that she was holding herself together, and he did not need to worry about her. Not today, not on this train, not yet. They had a long way still to go. Sevier County had been good to them in the way that Appalachian valleys are good to the families who learn to read them. Marlena had been born in a hollow on the North Fork of the Pigeon River, to a father named Caleb Worth, who could look at a piece of ground and tell you what would grow on it before he had walked the perimeter, and to a mother named Hannah, who had taught her to keep a kitchen garden that fed 8 people through 3 seasons on less than a 1/4 acre of carefully tended soil. The hollow where she grew up had been settled by her great-grandfather, Eben Worth, in 1812, and the bottomland along the river had been farmed by Worths for 70 years by the time Marlena was old enough to walk it. The knowledge of that ground, the way it flooded in March and lay dormant under 3 inches of standing water for 2 weeks before the slow draw of the river finally took the moisture back. The way the corn planted on the slightly elevated beds her grandfather had cut by hand outproduced anything the ridge farms above the hollow could grow even in a wet year. The way the spring deposit of silt from the river held nitrogen. The way a bank holds money. All of that had been her inheritance before she could read. She had married Jeremiah Thatcher when she was 19, and he was 23, and they had taken over a piece of bottomland 3 miles upriver from her father's place ground that had been written off as unworkable by the family who owned it because the river bent against it in a way that flooded the lower acres every spring. Jeremiah had looked at that ground the same way she had looked at it, with the trained eye of someone who understood that the flood was the gift, not the curse, and they had bought the parcel for $200 on a 5-year note and paid it off in 4. He had been a quiet man with a careful mind. A man who had taught himself surveying from a textbook he ordered out of Philadelphia, and who kept his weather records and his yield numbers with the discipline of an accountant, because he believed that what could be measured could be improved, and what could be improved could be passed on. They had been good together. They had been happy in the steady, unspoken way of partners whose work matches. Eli had been born in the 2nd year of their marriage, the only child the years would give them, though they had wanted more, and Marlena had taught the boy to read at 4, and to plant at 5, and to keep his own small ledger at 7, because she believed what Jeremiah believed, that knowledge was not a thing you held in your head. It was a thing you wrote down where time could not lose it. Then Jeremiah had started coughing in the autumn of 1881, and by Christmas he was bedridden, and by the 2nd week of January he was dead. He had been 41 years old. The train pulled into Council Bluffs at 3 in the afternoon, and Marlena and Eli changed cars and rode west across the Missouri River into Nebraska. And the country opened up in the way that mid-American prairie opens up to a person who has spent her whole life in the folded hills of East Tennessee, with a vastness that was not empty exactly, but simply unconcerned, a horizon that did not bend or curve or hide anything, a sky that took up 4 times as much of the visible world as any sky she had grown up under. Eli pressed his face to the window. He had never seen anything like it. Marlena watched her son watch the country and thought about Jeremiah's letter in the trunk and about the folded map she had not shown the boy yet. And she thought about Bartholomew Cruz, the name she had been preparing herself to hear for 3 months now, since the letters from her cousin Ezra in Plattsmouth had begun to arrive. The train reached Plattsmouth in the late afternoon of April 4th. She was looking for the land office. The land office of Cass County was a single-story clapboard building on the east side of Main Street in Plattsmouth, with a hand-painted sign over the door that read, "Public domain entries and homestead filings" in letters that had faded from the original black to a tired charcoal gray. A folding table had been set up under the wooden awning that shaded the front porch, and a land agent named Silas Mercer was working through a line of men who had come from as far as Indiana and Kentucky and Pennsylvania to claim what remained of the parcels available in the spring opening. There were maps spread across the table, large survey plats with the section numbers and the topographic contours and the notations about water and timber and existing improvements, and the men were moving through the maps with the focused intensity of poker players studying a layout for tells. Marlena and Eli arrived just before noon. The men at the table looked up when she approached. She was used to it. A woman alone in a land office in 1884 was unusual enough to draw attention, and her clothing made her unusualness specific. The dark wool dress that had been mended carefully at the cuffs and the elbows and the hem. The small black hat that had traveled from Tennessee with her and that bore the dust of 3 states in its weave. The worn but well cared for boots that had walked the hollows of Sevier County for a decade and would now walk Nebraska. She held Eli's hand. He stood beside her with the gravity of a boy who had been told that this morning was important and that he was to watch and learn and not speak unless spoken to, and he did exactly that. Marlena took her place at the back of the line. She did not approach the table. She did not even as men filed up to it and laid their fingers on the high ground parcels, the ridge plots, with the southern exposures and the well-drained upland slopes. The obvious choices that any farmer with 2 seasons of experience would have made in their place. She watched. The line moved. By 2 in the afternoon, the best parcels were gone, claimed by men who counted out their filing fees in coin, and signed their names with the satisfied small ceremony of settlers who had traveled a long way to be exactly here doing exactly this. By 3, the remaining options had thinned to the parcels the line had been working its way around all morning. The second-tier choices, the wet ground and the rough ground, and the parcels with the survey notes that mentioned standing water or seasonal flooding or hillside drainage that made a piece of land more trouble than it was worth. By 4, only one man stood at the table besides Mercer. He was the broad-shouldered Iowan, and he had been considering Plat 47 for almost 3 full minutes, crouched at the table with his finger tracing the contour lines and his jaw set in the private working way of a man who is doing arithmetic in his head about whether something he has identified as risky is risky enough to walk away from. After 3 minutes, he straightened, shook his head in the small dismissive way of a man closing a question, and walked away from the table without a word to Mercer. Plat 47 sat alone in the afternoon light. Marlena stepped forward. Silas Mercer was 48 years old, and he had been selling frontier parcels for 11 years, and he had seen, by his own count, several thousand people make the decision he was about to watch this Tennessee widow make. He looked at her with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had learned over a long career that customers came in all conditions, and that his job was to process the paperwork, not to second-guess the choices. But he could not entirely keep the concern out of his voice when she pointed to Plat 47 and said in the careful, low, Appalachian-inflected English of her childhood that this was the parcel she wanted to file on. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to be straight with you about that piece." "Please do," she said. "That's basin ground. The creek floods every April, and most years it holds water through May. The middle of the parcel sits in a natural depression that pools after every significant rain and doesn't drain out for a week, sometimes longer. You'll have standing water on a portion of that ground for 2 months out of the growing season. There are better choices still available, ma'am. There's a parcel west of town on the upper terrace that's been overlooked. That's good ground. That's the kind of ground a person can work." Marlena nodded. She had heard him out completely the way she had been taught to listen by a father who believed that a woman who could not let a man finish his sentence had given away an advantage she would later need. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I appreciate the kindness of what you just said. I want Plat 47. She opened the small cloth purse she had carried from Tennessee. She counted out the filing fee in coins on the table. She signed her name on the patent application in the careful, upright hand of a woman who had learned penmanship from her mother by candlelight. And she watched Mercer initial the claim, and she folded the receipt copy and put it inside the small leather wallet where she kept her important papers. And she took Eli's hand, and she walked away from the table toward the wagon she had rented from the livery stable on the corner of Main and Fifth. Silas Mercer watched her go. He stood for a long moment at the folding table looking at the spot where she had stood. And then he looked down at the plat map that still showed parcel 47, and he looked at the contour lines, and at the notation of the creek, and at the survey marker that indicated the natural depression in the center of the parcel, and he felt the small, uncomfortable feeling of a man who had just watched something he could not entirely explain. He folded the map. He walked back inside the office. There was a second land agent named Royden Pike who handled the records and the cross-referencing of new claims against existing speculation purchases. And Mercer carried the patent application back to him and laid it on his desk. "That widow," Mercer said. "She took 47. Pike looked up from his ledger. 47. 47. Pike set down his pen. He pulled a thick gray ledger from the cabinet behind his desk and opened it to a page marked with a leather tab, and he ran his finger down a column of section numbers, and he stopped at the row that corresponded to Plat 47. And he looked at Mercer with the slow, careful expression of a man whose afternoon had just become considerably more complicated. "Cruz wanted that one," Pike said. Mercer said nothing. "Cruz has been holding off filing on it for 8 months, waiting for the price to fall in the post-spring window. He had it marked for the bypass purchase. The rail company hasn't finalized the survey yet, but the bypass is going through that basin, Silas. He needs that water and that east-west crossing." "I didn't know. Nobody knew. He's been keeping it quiet." Mercer rubbed the back of his neck. "The widow had her filing fee. The patent's in her name. There's nothing irregular." Pike looked at the application. He read her name slowly. "Thatcher," he said. "Marlena Thatcher, Tennessee." "That's her." Pike closed the ledger. "He's not going to be happy, Silas." "I imagine he won't." "You want to be the one to tell him." Mercer looked out the window of the office toward the corner where the wagon had been parked. But the wagon was gone now, and Main Street was filling with the late afternoon foot traffic of men coming back from the livery, and women carrying parcels from the dry goods store, and children running ahead of their mothers in the warm April light. "I'll tell him," Mercer said. "Tonight." The wagon Marlena had rented took her and Eli out the east road from Plattsmouth at a slow, steady walk behind a pair of borrowed mules, and the afternoon sun was already starting to soften toward evening when they reached the edge of Plat 47, and Marlena pulled the mules up at the section corner where the survey marker stood in the long prairie grass. She climbed down from the wagon seat. Eli climbed down behind her. They stood at the edge of their land. The basin opened in front of them, a long, shallow bowl of ground that ran roughly a quarter mile north to south, and a little less east to west, ringed on 3 sides by the low, gentle curve of hills that rose perhaps 60 feet above the basin floor at their highest point. The creek that the survey had noted ran along the eastern edge, its banks dark with the heavy soil that moisture-rich ground accumulates over decades, and the natural depression at the center of the parcel held the late afternoon shadow of standing water from a rain that must have come through 3 or 4 days earlier. The light on the surface of that water was the color of beaten pewter. The grass at the edges of the depression was thicker and taller than the grass on the surrounding ground. The deep, saturated green of vegetation that had access to moisture other plants in the area could only dream about. Eli was quiet beside her. "Mother," he said finally. "Yes." "That ground has water on it." "Yes." "They said it would." "They did." He looked up at her. "Father knew about this place, didn't he?" She looked at her son. "He did." Eli looked back at the basin. "Is the map in the trunk a map of this place?" "Yes." "Did Father come here?" "He did." "When?" "The fall before he died, before he got sick. He came out here on the railroad and walked this ground for 4 days. He took the samples that are in the trunk. He drew the map. He filed the report with himself before he came home." Eli was silent for a moment. He knew he was going to die. Marlena looked at her son. He knew he was sick. He didn't know how bad it was, but he wanted us to have a place. He thought we might need a place that was ours, separate from his family after he was gone. Eli looked at the basin. Why this place? Because he understood it, the way Grandpa Worth understood the hollow. Your father saw what was wrong with it the same way the other men saw it, but he also saw the rest of it, the part the other men miss. What's the rest of it? She put her hand on his shoulder. That's what I'm going to teach you, Eli. That's what the next 5 years are about. They built the cabin on the slightly elevated northern edge of the property on a small rise of drier ground that sat about 8 feet above the basin floor at its highest point. And they built it small and tight and low because Marlena had no interest in spending labor on shelter beyond what shelter required. The first 3 days were a frenzy of physical work that she and Eli did entirely themselves with the materials she had purchased on credit at the lumber yard in Plattsmouth. And at the end of the 3rd day, they had a 1-room structure with a packed earth floor and a stone chimney and a roof that did not leak. And they unpacked the trunk and laid Jeremiah's surveying tools out on the small table she had built from milled boards. And they ate a supper of bread and cheese and cold ham by the light of a kerosene lamp. And Eli fell asleep on the rope bed in the corner, while Marlena sat at the table and opened the leather-bound journal her husband had left her. She turned to the back of the journal. The folded map was there. She unfolded it and laid it flat on the table. It was a topographic sketch of Plat 47 drawn in Jeremiah's careful hand with the contour lines marked in pencil and the creek drawn in ink, and the depression at the center of the basin marked with a small spiral that meant standing water. And along the eastern edge of the map, there were small numbered marks where Jeremiah had taken soil samples and recorded their depths. And at the bottom of the map, in his upright, deliberate writing, there was a single sentence. This is the ground. Read what it offers and add nothing it does not need. She sat looking at the map for a long time. She thought about Jeremiah walking this basin in the late autumn of 1881, before the cough had become the lung sickness, before either of them had known what was coming. And she imagined him moving across the wet ground, with his auger and his notebook taking samples and writing his observations. and she felt the long, slow, accumulated weight of being loved by a man who had thought about her future after he was no longer in it. She folded the map. She put it back in the journal. She blew out the lamp. She did not open the sealed letter. Not yet. The next morning, at first light, she walked the basin with Eli at her side, and she showed him how to read what they were standing on. She showed him the dark line in the soil at the eastern bank of the creek, where decades of seasonal sediment had built up in alternating layers of silt and organic matter. She showed him the way the grass changed color across the basin floor, the deeper green of the depression, where the water gathered the slightly paler shade of the better drained margins, the thin, pale, brittle quality of the grass at the upper edges where the basin met the rising hills. She showed him the angle of the slopes around them, and she told him to feel the air at the basin floor against the air at the upper edge. And he stood quietly with his head tilted in the way of a boy concentrating. And after a moment, he said that the air at the basin floor was warmer. "Why?" she asked him. "Because the hills block the wind. And it's lower, so the cold air at night would settle here, so it should be colder." "But it isn't." "No." "Why?" he thought. "Because the hills hold the day's warmth. They radiate it back, and there's no wind to take it away." She looked at her son. "Yeah." She showed him the channels she was going to dig. She walked him along the natural drainage paths that the water followed when it moved through the basin after a heavy rain. And she explained to him the difference between drainage and distribution, and how the channels she wanted to build were not going to take the water off the land, but were instead going to spread the water evenly across the field beds so that no one part of the basin held more than the soil could absorb. She drew the pattern in the dirt with a stick. He watched. He understood. He had been working alongside his father in their bottomland in Tennessee since he was 6 years old, and the language of water and soil was already familiar to him in the way a second language is familiar to a child raised in a bilingual house. They started digging that afternoon. The next week brought the first visitor. His name was Garrick Brindle. He lived on the ridge a quarter-mile north of the basin, and he had filed on his ground 4 years earlier, and had built a respectable upland farm on it that produced the kind of average yield the soil supported. He was 45 years old, a widower himself, raising 2 daughters and a young son, with the steady decency of a man who had never expected life to be easy and was therefore not disappointed when it was not. He rode down to the fence line of Plat 47 on a Tuesday morning in late April and watched Marlena and Eli working in the wet ground, cutting shallow channels in a pattern that did not to his eye make any immediately discernible sense. He called out to her, "Mrs. Thatcher." She straightened, leaned on the shovel, wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Mr. Brindle, I want to be neighborly about this. I rode down because I want to tell you something I'd want a neighbor to tell me." "Please do." "That ground won't drain. Whatever you're cutting there, it's not going to take the water off." The creek feeds the basin too steady. The natural depression in the middle of your parcel is going to hold whatever you put into it and add to it. Marlena looked at him. She did not smile, but the corners of her mouth softened in the small, private way of someone who has been told something she has known her entire adult life. "I appreciate the kindness of what you just said, Mr. Brindle," she said. "I am not trying to drain it." He looked at her. He looked at the channels she had cut. He frowned in the slow, careful way of a man whose initial assumption has just been contradicted and who is now trying to construct a new one. "What are you trying to do then?" "I'm trying to distribute it." He looked at the channels again. He did not understand. He nodded politely. He said he would not keep her from her work. He rode back up to the ridge with the slight unsettled feeling of a man who had ridden down to deliver advice and had instead been given the suggestion that the situation was more complicated than his advice had accounted for. That evening, in the small clapboard house at the eastern edge of Plattsmouth, where he had kept his offices for 31 years, Bartholomew Cruz sat at his desk in the lamplight and read the patent application that Silas Mercer had brought to him just before sundown. He read it twice. He read the name a third time. He set the paper on his desk. He sat for a long while without speaking in the perfect stillness that the small clock on the mantel ticked into and the kerosene lamp burned into and the night beyond the window pressed against. He was 58 years old. He had built his fortune over 35 years in Cass County through a combination of patience and information and the willingness to acquire ground that other men did not yet understand was about to become valuable, and he had been waiting on Plat 47 for 8 months specifically because the rail bypass survey that he had paid 2 separate engineers to draft for him had identified that basin as the necessary east-west crossing for the line that would connect the Plattsmouth Depot to the new spur being built south toward Nebraska City. The bypass required the water. The bypass required the crossing. The bypass required Plat 47. And Bartholomew Cruz had structured the next 5 years of his commercial life around the assumption that he would be the one to provide that ground to the rail company at a price that would compensate him for the patience he had shown in waiting. A widow from Tennessee had filed on it that afternoon. A widow with a 12-year-old son and a rented wagon and a filing fee paid in coin. He picked up the paper again. He looked at her name, Marlena Thatcher. He read it one more time. He set the paper down. He rose from the desk. He walked to the window of his office and looked out at the dark street and the gas lamps that marked the corners of the intersections in the part of town that had street lighting. And he thought about what he was going to do next. And he was a careful man, and he did not act on the first impulse that came to him, and he did not act on the second. And by the time he turned away from the window and walked back to his desk, he had decided that the first thing he would do was wait. He would let her settle. He would let her work. He would let her develop an attachment to the ground because attached owners were easier to negotiate with than indifferent ones, and easier still to pressure when negotiation failed. In the meantime, he would learn what he could about her. He sat back down at his desk. He pulled out a sheet of paper and his pen, and he began to write a letter to a man he kept on retainer in Knoxville, Tennessee, who handled this kind of inquiry for him on a regular basis. He asked the man to find out what he could about a widow named Marlena Thatcher of Sevier County, deceased husband Jeremiah, 12-year-old son named Eli, and to report back to him at his Plattsmouth address within 30 days. He signed the letter. He folded it. He set it in his outgoing tray for the morning post. In the basin on the eastern edge of Cass County, the kerosene lamp in the cabin on the northern rise burned out a little after 10 that night, and Marlena Thatcher closed her husband's leather-bound journal and laid her hand briefly on the unopened sealed letter that lived between its pages, and she did not open it because she had not yet earned the right to open it in the private accounting she had set herself. And she slept that night for the first time on the land she had chosen. The first 3 weeks at Plat 47 were the kind of physical labor that turns a person's hands into something different from what they had been before. Marlena and Eli worked from before sunrise to past sundown, and the basin began to take the shape of the system that her husband's notes and her own intuition had drawn for it, a network of shallow channels that did not so much remove the water from the field as guide it. By the second week, they had cut almost 300 yards of distribution trench across the lower beds, and the standing water in the central depression had begun to redistribute itself into defined pools and defined dry paths between them, the way water always sorts itself when given the small directional encouragement of a well-cut channel. Eli developed blisters on his hands and let them harden into callus. Marlena watched her son grow steadier and quieter with each day of the work. Garrick Brindle rode down a second time at the end of the second week. He watched the channels. He did not say anything for a long while. Eventually, he climbed down from his horse and walked to the fence line, and he asked Marlena, in the slow, careful way of a man asking a question he had been turning over in his mind for several days, whether she would be willing to explain to him exactly what the channels were for. She did. She walked him along one of them. She showed him where it began at the upper edge of the basin and where it ended at the field bed it served, and she explained the principle of distribution rather than drainage. And she explained the way the bed itself was slightly raised by hand so that the channel could feed it from the side, and the excess could move on to the next bed rather than pooling on the first. Brindle listened. He listened the whole way. When she finished, he stood for a long moment with his hands in his pockets, looking at the channels, looking at the basin, looking at the line of hills that curved around it. And finally, he said quietly, in the voice of a man speaking to himself as much as to her, that he had never seen anything quite like it before, but that he had a feeling he was looking at something worth paying attention to. He thanked her. He rode back up to the ridge. That evening, in the parlor of the Plattsmouth boarding house where the Reverend Linus Quill had been taking his evening meals since his wife passed 3 years earlier. A man named Royden Pike, the same. Royden Pike, who worked at the land office, sat across the table from the Reverend and shared a long, careful conversation about the Tennessee widow who had taken up basin ground east of town and who was now being talked about, the man said, in ways that perhaps the Reverend ought to be aware of as a leader of the local Methodist congregation. Pike was eating supper on Bartholomew Crew's account. The Reverend Quill did not know this. The Reverend listened to Pike's careful framing of the situation, and he nodded slowly, and he agreed that he would consider what Pike had said. A woman alone on the prairie working the kind of ground a sensible woman would not work was not necessarily a theological problem. But she was not necessarily not one either. The Reverend would think on it. The first Sunday of May, Marlena and Eli walked into the small white Methodist church on Pine Street in Plattsmouth, and they sat in the third pew from the back, and they listened to the Reverend Linus Quill deliver a sermon on the subject of stewardship and the proper ordering of households under God. The Reverend did not look at Marlena directly during the sermon. He did not name her, but there were several passages in his text that any attentive listener could have understood as commentary on a particular situation, and Marlena, who had been raised in the Methodist tradition in East Tennessee, and who had heard 1,000 sermons in her 38 years, understood exactly what was being said and exactly to whom. She sat with her hands folded in her lap. She sang the hymns at the appointed times. She thanked the Reverend at the door when the service ended. She walked Eli back to the wagon. She drove home. Eli was quiet on the ride. "Mother," he said when they were halfway back to the basin. "Yes." "He was talking about you." "He was." "Why?" She looked at the road ahead. "Because someone told him to." The boy was silent for a moment. "Who?" "I'll know that before long." That night, after Eli was asleep, Marlena sat at the table and opened her own ledger, the small leather-bound one she had begun keeping the day they arrived, and she made an entry in her careful, upright hand. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the Reverend. She wrote the substance of the sermon. She wrote her own observations of the sermon's purpose. She wrote beneath all of it a single sentence. "Someone is paying attention." She closed the ledger. She blew out the lamp. She did not yet know about Bartholomew Crew's. She did not yet know about the letter he had sent to Knoxville, or the report he was waiting for, or the patient, long game he had begun to organize against her. She did not yet know that within 10 days, a man she had never met would knock on her cabin door with an offer to buy her land at twice the price she had paid for it, or that the offer would be the first of several, or that within a year a stranger would come in the night and put kerosene down her well. She did not know any of that. What she knew was the ground. What she knew was the work. What she knew was that her husband had walked this basin in the autumn before he died, and had seen in it what she now saw in it, and that he had left her a map, and a journal, and a sealed letter that she was not yet ready to open, and that whatever came next, she would meet it the way she had been raised to meet whatever came, which was with her hands on the shovel, and her eyes on the soil, and her mind on the long, slow, patient calculation of what the land was capable of giving and what it required in return. She slept. In the morning, she rose before the sun. She went out to the channels. She went back to work. The summer of 1884 arrived in Cass County, the way summers arrive in eastern Nebraska, with a slow gathering of heat across the open prairie, and a sky that lifted itself higher each week, as though making room for the season that was coming. And Marlena Thatcher and her son Eli worked their basin from before sunrise to past sundown, through the long days of May and into the longer days of June. And the channels she had cut in April began to do exactly what she had designed them to do, which was to take the water the basin received from rain and from the steady feed of the creek, and to spread it across the field beds in a pattern that no other farm in the county could replicate, because no other farm in the county had the terrain that made it possible. The corn she planted in the second week of May came up in 9 days. The germination rate was the kind of rate that makes a farmer stop at the end of a row and stand for a moment with the simple, unguarded pleasure of a person who is being shown that the work has been correct. She planted Tennessee dent corn on the slightly elevated beds between the channels, the same variety her grandfather, Eben Worth, had planted in the hollow on the North Fork of the Pigeon River. For 40 years before her, the seed she had carried in a canvas sack from Sevier County, because she trusted it the way a person trusts a tool that has been in the family long enough to know your hand. She planted denser than the local Nebraska practice, called for 12 inches between stalks instead of 16, because the soil beneath those beds was so rich in nitrogen-bearing organic matter that the conventional spacing simply did not apply to what she was working with. On the wet margins where the channels still held shallow flowing water through most of the day, she planted a sweet potato variety she had brought from home, a variety bred over generations of Worth and Thatcher farming for exactly this kind of consistently moist, mineral-rich soil. Along the creek edge, she planted willow cuttings for erosion control. In the shallow depression at the basin center, where standing water persisted longest, she let the natural plant community establish itself. She did not fence the entire parcel. She fenced the home garden and the immediate yard around the cabin, and she let the rest of the basin run open to the prairie, because she was not yet ready to commit resources to fencing ground whose final use she was still working out. The well she dug the day after the kerosene incident, well to the east of the cabin and well away from the original well that some unknown hand had poisoned in the dark, came in at 22 feet, and the water that filled it was cold and clear and tasted of the limestone aquifer that ran beneath the basin, and that she had identified as her insurance against any further mischief in the night. She did not report the poisoning to the county sheriff. She had thought about it for 2 days, and she had decided against it because she did not yet know who had paid for the act. And she did not know which deputies in the sheriff's office took envelopes from which men, and she preferred to keep the fact of her noticing the kerosene to herself until she had a better understanding of who she was actually dealing with. Garrick Brindle rode down a 3rd time on the first Saturday of June. He stood at the fence line for a long while. He watched the corn. Eventually, he said in a voice that carried a tone Marlena had not heard from him before, that the corn on her ground was 11 inches taller than the corn on his ground across the fence, and that he had measured it twice that morning before riding down, because he had not been able to believe his first measurement. She told him that the difference would widen. He asked her how that was possible. She told him about the soil depth at the basin floor and about the organic content that decades of water-carried sediment had deposited, and about the way the channels she had cut were not draining water, but were instead distributing it in a pattern that kept every part of the field beds within the optimal moisture range for the root development of the variety she had planted. She told him that she expected to harvest 40 bushels of corn to the acre on her best beds, which was almost twice the county average for the previous year, and that she expected to do better than that in her 2nd season, as the channels deepened into the soil and the beds settled into their permanent form. Brindle listened. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he asked her in the slow, careful way of a man asking a question he had been preparing for several days whether she would consider walking his ground with him sometime that summer, and giving him her opinion of what he was working with. She said she would. She said it without hesitation. She had decided weeks earlier that she was not going to be in the business of withholding what she knew, because what she knew was rooted in terrain that nobody else in the county had, and any farmer who tried to apply her principles to ridge ground would find that the principles required ground she was the only one who owned. She could afford to be generous. Generosity in her position was a luxury that geography had already paid for. Brindle thanked her. He rode back up to the ridge with the kind of small interior recalculation that men of his age do not often perform in public. The truck garden that Marlena had planted on 3/4 of an acre on the better-drained northern beds came in faster than the local growing season was supposed to allow. By the 2nd week of June, she was carrying baskets of early bell peppers and the first ripe tomatoes into Plattsmouth twice a week, and the German grocer on 6th Street, a man named Otto Bergstrom, who had immigrated from Hanover 30 years earlier, and who had been running the same shop in Plattsmouth since 1863, took one look at her produce on the first visit and offered her a standing weekly purchase at a price that represented 3 times what the same space in corn would have yielded her. Bergstrom understood quality. He understood that a tomato grown in deep, moist, organic soil was a different commodity from a tomato grown in thin ridge clay. He understood that there were customers in Plattsmouth German families, mostly who would pay a premium for produce of the kind Marlena was bringing him, and he was willing to be the merchant who served those customers. She accepted the contract on the spot. She walked out of his shop with $12 in her purse from that first delivery and the promise of regular income through the rest of the summer. She bought Eli a new pair of boots on the way home. He needed them. He had grown an inch since they had left Tennessee. The first letter from Bartholomew Cruz's man in Knoxville arrived in Plattsmouth on the 15th of June. It was a long letter. The Knoxville man had done his work thoroughly. He had ridden out to Sevier County, and he had asked the questions a man like him knew how to ask in the careful, indirect way that does not draw attention to itself. And he had assembled a report on Marlena Thatcher that covered 3 full pages in his small, precise hand. The report described her family of origin,
the Worths of the North Fork of the Pigeon River, 3 generations of bottomland farmers with a reputation for getting unusual yields out of land that other families had given up on. It described her late husband, Jeremiah Thatcher, a quiet, careful surveyor's son who had taught himself a profession out of textbooks and who had been known in Sevier County for the kind of methodical record-keeping that local farmers had occasionally hired him to perform when they were buying or selling parcels and needed an honest evaluation of what they were working with. It described their 12-year marriage.
It described the bottomland farm they had built together, and the way they had paid off the note in 4 years on a 5-year obligation. It described his death in January of 1882 and the lung sickness that had taken him. The report described one other thing. The Knoxville man had spoken in his careful, indirect way to a railroad surveyor in Chattanooga who had known Jeremiah Thatcher through their shared trade, and the surveyor had mentioned almost in passing that Jeremiah had taken a long trip to Nebraska in the autumn of 1881, just before the cough had become serious, and that he had spent 4 days walking a basin parcel in Cass County, and that he had returned to Tennessee with soil samples and a set of contour drawings, and that he had told the surveyor in confidence that he had found a piece of ground he intended to file on as soon as he could arrange the family's relocation. The Knoxville man's report ended with the small observation that the widow's choice of parcel in Cass County was therefore not a random selection, but the completion of a plan her husband had developed before his death. Bartholomew Cruz read this report at his desk in the lamplight on the evening of June 15th. He read it twice. He set it down. He thought for a long time. He had been preparing himself since April to deal with a Tennessee widow who had perhaps stumbled into ground she did not fully understand. The report on his desk told him a different story. The report told him that he was dealing with a woman who had inherited 3 generations of accumulated terrain literacy, and whose husband had specifically identified and reconnoitered the parcel she now held. The report told him that the basin he needed for his rail bypass had been chosen by a man who had walked it with surveying tools, and that the woman now working it was applying that man's knowledge with the trained patience of someone who had spent her entire life learning the same trade. He had not expected this. He had expected he saw now in the lamplight to be dealing with a woman whose attachment to the land would be primarily sentimental and whose practical understanding would be limited to what a frontier widow could be assumed to possess. He was instead dealing with a competitor. He rose from his desk and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark street. He thought. When he returned to the desk, he sat down and he wrote a second letter. This one to his attorney in Lincoln, asking the attorney to research the homestead patent regulations regarding sole female applicants with minor children, and to identify any procedural irregularities that might exist in the filing of a parcel under those conditions, with particular attention to the question of whether a male head of household was required for the patent to be considered valid under the 1862 Homestead Act, as it had been amended in subsequent legislation. He signed the letter. He set it in the outgoing tray. He blew out the lamp. The Reverend Linus Quill came calling on the basin 3 days later. He came on a Wednesday afternoon in his small black buggy, driving alone with the careful, upright posture of a man who had been delivering pastoral visits for 35 years and who knew that the form of the visit mattered as much as its content. Marlena saw him coming a quarter-mile off from the elevated ground where she was working with Eli on the eastern channels, and she straightened up and watched him approach, and she dried her hands on her apron and walked to meet him at the cabin door. She did not invite him inside. She did not need to. The Reverend was a man who understood doorways. He sat on the small bench she had built at the side of the cabin in the partial shade of the eave, and he accepted the cup of water she offered him, and he commented on the unusual character of her crops, the dark green of the corn visible from the road. The orderly geometry of the channels she had cut the obvious investment of labor that her parcel had received in the 8 weeks since she had filed on it. He did all of this in the polite, indirect language of a man who was getting to the actual purpose of his visit by way of a comfortable preamble. Eventually, he reached the purpose. "Sister Thatcher," he said, "I want to be candid with you about something, because candor is a courtesy I believe I owe to a member of my congregation, and because I prefer to address concerns directly rather than allow them to develop in the cloudy form they take when they are spoken about only behind closed doors." Marlena waited. "There has been some discussion," the Reverend said, "about the manner in which you are working this ground. Some of our parishioners, men of long experience in agriculture, have expressed concern that the methods you are applying here are not consistent with the practices the Lord has shown to be sound for the agriculture of this country. They have expressed concern in particular that a woman alone without the guidance of a husband or a father or a brother may be in a vulnerable position with respect to errors of judgment that more experienced counsel might have helped her to avoid." Marlena did not answer immediately. She looked at the Reverend for a long moment. She looked at him with the careful, neutral attention that her father had taught her to direct at men whose words were not yet fully arrived at their meaning, and she waited for him to continue, because she had learned that men of the Reverend's type usually did continue if you simply allowed them the silence in which to do it. The Reverend continued, "I want to be helpful, Sister Thatcher. The Methodist Episcopal Church in Plattsmouth has at its disposal a number of men who would be willing to advise you on the practical management of your parcel. I myself would be willing to speak to several of these men on your behalf. There would be no obligation. The advice would be offered in a spirit of Christian fellowship, with the understanding that a widow in your position should not be expected to manage these matters alone." Marlena nodded slowly. "Reverend Quill," she said. "Yes. I want to thank you for the genuine concern that I can hear in what you have just said." "You are welcome. I also want to say something to you in the same spirit of candor that you opened with, because I think you have earned a frank answer from me, and I would not want to leave you with any impression that I am being evasive about my situation. Please." She folded her hands in her lap. "My father, Caleb Worth of Sevier County, Tennessee, was the best reader of bottomland in 3 counties of East Tennessee. My grandfather, Eben Worth, who settled the hollow on the North Fork of the Pigeon River in 1812, taught my father the trade. My mother, Hannah Worth, taught me to keep a kitchen garden that fed 8 people through 3 seasons on a 1/4 acre. My husband, Jeremiah Thatcher, was a self-taught surveyor and a careful agriculturalist, and we farmed bottomland in Sevier County for 12 years before he died, and our farm in that period produced yields that were the talk of the local Grange meetings. My husband walked this basin in the autumn of 1881. He chose it. The map I am working from is his. The principles I am applying are his and mine together, refined across 15 years of partnership before the lung sickness took him. I am not reverend, working in the absence of guidance. I am working with the accumulated guidance of 3 generations of agriculturalists and a husband whose understanding of this particular ground was specific and documented before I ever set foot on it." The Reverend looked at her. She continued, "I appreciate the offer of advice from the men of your congregation. I would welcome neighborly conversation with any of them at any time. But I want to be clear with you, Reverend, that the question of whether I should be working this ground is not a question that is open to be revisited. The ground is mine. The work is mine. The decisions are mine. I will be in the 3rd pew on Sunday morning. I will sing the hymns at the appointed times. I will give what I can to the collection plate, and I will go home to my farm and work it according to the understanding that has been entrusted to me by the people who taught me how to do this." She waited. The Reverend looked at her. He looked at her for a long while. He set down his cup of water. He rose from the bench. "Sister Thatcher," he said, "I will give your words the consideration they deserve." "Thank you, Reverend. Good day to you." "Good day." He drove his buggy back up the road toward Plattsmouth, and Marlena stood at the door of her cabin and watched him go. And Eli came up from the channel he had been working and stood beside her and watched the buggy until it was small in the distance. And the boy looked up at his mother with the steady, serious eyes of a son who had been listening to every word of the conversation from a distance of 40 feet through the open window of the cabin.
"Mother,"
he said.
"Yes. Was he the one?"
He was a piece of it. Who's the rest? She put her hand on his shoulder. I'll know that before long. That Sunday morning in the small white church on Pine Street, the Reverend Linus Quill delivered a sermon that was not about Marlena Thatcher. The sermon was about the Book of Ruth. It was a careful sermon, thoughtfully constructed on the subject of widowhood and the dignity of women who carry the work of a household forward in the absence of the men who once led that household. The Reverend did not name Marlena. He did not glance in her direction, but several women in the congregation glanced at her during the sermon, and several men did not, and the sermon was understood by everyone in the room as a public correction of the previous Sunday's text. The kind of correction that a Methodist minister of the Reverend's generation rarely made, and that he made only when he had decided in the privacy of his own conscience that he had been used by someone whose use of him no longer sat well with him. After the service, the Reverend stood at the door and shook hands with each member of the congregation as they left. And when Marlena reached him, he held her hand for an extra moment. "Sister Thatcher," he said. "Reverend, I trust your work is going well." "It is." "Good." That was all. But Garrick Brindle, who had not been in the third pew of any church in 12 years before that Sunday, watched the exchange from the back of the sanctuary with the small, careful attention of a man who was learning to read a community he had previously assumed he already understood. The corn at the end of June was 12 inches taller than the corn across the fence on Brindle's Ridge. By the second week of July, it was 16 inches taller, and the stalks were thick at the base in the way that indicated deep root penetration into rich soil. And the color of the leaves was the dark, saturated green that came from full nitrogen availability in the root zone. And Eli walked the rows in the early mornings before the heat of the day, and reported to his mother that he could not see the end of one row from the other end because the corn had grown over his head. He was 12 years old. The corn was over 7 feet tall by July 15th. The first letter from the Lincoln attorney to Bartholomew Cruz arrived on July 18th. The attorney had researched the question carefully. His report was disappointing to Cruz in its primary finding, which was that the Homestead Act of 1862, as amended through 1872, clearly permitted a widow with minor children to file as the head of household in her own right, and that the patent issued to Marlena Thatcher on Plat 47 of Cass County was therefore valid under federal statute and could not be challenged on the basis of her sole female status. The report was more interesting to Cruz in its secondary finding. The attorney noted that the patent process had been handled at the county level by the office of Royden Pike, the senior records clerk at the Cass County Land Office, and that the patent application itself, the original document signed by Marlena Thatcher on April 4th, 1884, was retained in Pike's files as the official record of the filing. The attorney observed in language so careful that it required 2 readings to grasp the suggestion he was making, that the integrity of any homestead patent was only as good as the integrity of the original signed document on file, and that in his experience, original documents in county land offices were occasionally found to contain irregularities that could be raised on subsequent review. Cruz read the letter twice. He understood exactly what his attorney was suggesting. He set the letter down. He thought. He was not by nature a man who paid for forgeries. He was a man who paid for patience and information and the long, slow accumulation of advantage. But he was also a man who understood that some situations required tools that fell outside his usual practice, and he was a man who had been doing business in Cass County long enough to know that Royden Pike was the kind of clerk whose loyalty was negotiable. That evening, in the back room of a tavern on Water Street in Plattsmouth, Bartholomew Cruz and Royden Pike sat across a small table from one another, and they had a quiet, careful conversation that lasted for almost 2 hours. And at the end of the conversation, Pike rose and shook the older man's hand and walked out into the warm July night, and Cruz paid the tavern's bill and walked back to his office, and within 10 days, the original patent application on file at the Cass County Land Office bore a single small irregularity that no casual reviewer would notice, but that any careful examiner could identify if she knew what to look for. The signature of Marlena Thatcher had been scratched out. A second signature in a hand that approximated hers but did not quite match. It had been written over the scratched out original. The change was small. The change was almost invisible. The change had been made by Royden Pike on a Tuesday afternoon when he was alone in the records room of the land office working at his small desk with a sharp penknife and a steady hand, and the lamp turned low so that no one passing the window would see what he was doing. He had been paid $40 for the work. He did not tell Silas Mercer. He did not tell anyone. He returned the file to its drawer. He went home. The drought of high summer 1884 did not come. The rains that year arrived on schedule in the pattern that Nebraska prairie rainfall settled into in the years that the great westerly weather systems behaved according to their long-term averages, and the basin received its proper share of the season's moisture, and the channels distributed that moisture across the field beds with the easy efficiency they were beginning to settle into. The harvest began in the second week of September. Marlena and Eli worked the corn rows with the help of a young man named Jeb Calloway, 22 years old, who had come down from a failing farm in Burt County, looking for paid work for the autumn, and who Marlena had hired on the recommendation of Garrick Brindle. Calloway was a steady hand. He was strong and willing and silent in the way of young men who had been raised by parents who did not encourage chatter. And he learned Marlena's methods quickly, and he worked alongside Eli with the easy, unspoken camaraderie that develops between a 12-year-old boy and a 22-year-old man when both of them are good at the same work. The corn came in at 43 bushels to the acre. The county average that year was 26. The truck garden brought in $118 across the summer in steady deliveries to Otto Bergstrom's shop on 6th Street, plus another $40 from a German grocer in Omaha who had heard about her tomatoes from Bergstrom and who had arranged for a weekly delivery by rail through the rest of the season. The sweet potato crop on the wet margins came in heavier than any sweet potato crop she had grown in Tennessee. The Tennessee heritage tobacco she had planted on a small experimental plot at the southern edge of the parcel produced leaves of a quality that surprised her because she had not been sure the Nebraska climate would suit it. And she sold the cured crop to a buyer in St. Joseph who took the whole lot at a price that paid for the second draft horse she had been wanting to buy. She bought the horse in October. She bought a proper 2-bottom plow in November. She put up the harvest hay and the corn into the small barn she and Calloway had built together in late August, and she prepared the basin for winter. And on a cold afternoon in early December, she sat at her table in the lamplight and did the accounting of her first year on Plat 47, and the numbers were what she had hoped they would be, and they were also what her husband Jeremiah had calculated they would be on the back page of his leather-bound journal in the careful hand of a man who had walked this basin in the autumn before he died. The numbers were good. They were better than good. They were the numbers of a farm that was going to make her family secure within 5 years, which was the time horizon her husband had projected, and which was the time horizon she had committed herself to as the proof of what they had chosen. She closed the ledger. She blew out the lamp. She did not yet open Jeremiah's sealed letter because she had not yet earned the right. The right would come later. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was the first winter Marlena and Eli spent in their basin cabin, and it was a hard winter in the way that Nebraska winters are hard, with a cold that came down out of the north in late November and held its grip on the prairie through most of February. The cabin was tight, and the chimney drew well, and they had enough wood cut and stacked to see them through, and the basin's sheltered position behind the curve of the surrounding hills meant that the worst of the wind passed over them rather than through them. They were warmer than the ridge farms. They knew it. Garrick Brindle and his children in the larger frame house on the upper ground a quarter-mile north took the full force of the prairie wind through January and February, and Marlena saw Brindle in town on a cold afternoon in early February and asked after his family. And he said only that the winter had been a long one and that his oldest girl had developed a cough he did not entirely like. She gave him a small jar of honey from her summer harvest. She told him to mix it with hot water and thyme. He thanked her. He took it home. The cough cleared by the end of the month. He brought her a side of cured pork in March in exchange for the honey, and she accepted it, and they were neighbors in a way they had not been the previous spring, and the small private accounting between them shifted in a way that did not require words to mark. The spring of 1885 came early. The thaw began in the second week of March, and Marlena and Calloway, who had stayed on through the winter for room and board, and a small monthly wage, began the work of extending the channel system into the upper margins of the basin, where the previous year's runoff had revealed gaps in the distribution pattern. The work was easier than the previous spring's work because the principles were established, and the channels she was adding were extensions of channels that already existed, and Eli, now 13, worked beside them with the confident efficiency of a boy who had completed a full agricultural cycle alongside his mother, and who understood what they were building and why. By the first week of April, she had the system ready for spring planting. She bought 2 milk cows from a farmer named Cyrus Holt, who lived on good upland ground 3 miles south, and she put the cows in a small pasture at the eastern edge of the basin, where the channel-fed grass stayed greener longer into dry stretches than any pasture in the county. The cows came in fresh by the middle of April, and Marlena and Eli began the small, steady, twice-daily labor of milking, and the butter and cream that the cows produced went into a small ice house Calloway had built that winter, from blocks cut from the Platte River, and twice a week Marlena drove the wagon into Plattsmouth with butter wrapped in cheesecloth for the customers who had begun to ask Otto Bergstrom whether his Tennessee widow had any dairy yet. She did. The dairy customers paid in cash. By May, she had 3 sources of weekly income beyond the corn crop, and the small leather purse where she kept her household money had begun to fill with the slow, steady accumulation that her husband had projected on the back page of his journal as the second-year curve. Harlan Pruitt knocked on her cabin door on the morning of May 14th. He was a thin man in a black coat, 45 years old, with the careful blank face of a clerk who had been sent to deliver bad news that he did not understand the full significance of. He carried a leather portfolio. He removed his hat when she opened the door. He asked in the polite, formal language of a county functionary whether he might have a few moments of her time on a matter regarding the patent on her parcel. She invited him to the bench at the side of the cabin. She did not invite him inside. He sat down. He opened the portfolio. He produced a document. The document, he explained, was a notice from the county records office indicating that a routine review of homestead patents filed in the spring of the previous year had identified an irregularity in the documentation of her parcel, specifically a discrepancy between the patent application on file and the patent issued with the discrepancy relating to the requirement of a male relative's signature for sole female applicants under certain provisions of the Homestead Statute. She was being given 30 days, the document stated, to remedy the irregularity by producing the necessary signature, or the patent would be subject to administrative review and potential rescission. Marlena read the document. She read it twice. She did not change her expression. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, Yes, ma'am. This document references the Preemption Act of 1841. Yes, ma'am, I believe it does. The Preemption Act was superseded by the Homestead Act of 1862 for matters relating to public domain entries. Pruitt's expression did not change. It also did not entirely hold. There was a small slippage at the corner of his mouth, the kind of slippage that occurs when a man who has been sent to deliver a piece of paper that he does not fully understand encounters a recipient who appears to understand it considerably better than he does. He recovered quickly. I am only the deliverer of the notice, ma'am. The legal questions are for the county attorney's office to resolve. I see. You have 30 days. I understand. He stood. He returned the document to the portfolio. He put on his hat. He drove his buggy back up the road toward Plattsmouth. Marlena sat on the bench for a long while after he left. Eli came up from the channel he had been working. He looked at his mother. Mother. Yes. Who was that? That was the second piece. The second piece of what? She looked at her son. The same thing as the Reverend. She did not go to the county attorney's office. She did not write to a lawyer in Lincoln. She drove the wagon into Plattsmouth that afternoon, and she went to the small white frame house on the corner of Pearl and 8th, where the widow of Judge Owen Blackwood had lived since her husband's death in 1879, and she knocked on the door of Theodora Blackwood, the woman who had ridden out to the basin in early May to introduce herself, and who had said on that visit that if Marlena ever found herself in a particular kind of trouble in Cass County, she should come to this door before she went to any other door. Theodora Blackwood opened the door herself. She looked at Marlena. She looked at the wagon at the curb. She looked at the empty seat beside Marlena, where Eli was not, because Marlena had left the boy at the basin with Jeb Calloway for the afternoon. You have come, Theodora said. I have come. Step inside. Theodora Blackwood was 52 years old. She had been the wife of a man who had served as the chief judge of the Cass County District Court for 16 years, and she had been his widow for the last 6 years, and she had inherited from him a small but well-managed fortune and a deep familiarity with the legal and commercial affairs of the county that she had acquired across 30 years of marriage to a man who had not been in the habit of hiding his work from his wife. She lived alone in the house on Pearl Street with a single housekeeper and a small parlor lined with her husband's books. And she had said to Marlena on the day of the first visit that Bartholomew Cruz had cost her late husband $12,000 in a railroad bond fraud in 1873, that the judge had not been able to pursue to conviction because of procedural difficulties, and that she had been waiting in patient, quiet anger for almost 12 years for an opportunity to be useful to anyone who found themselves on the wrong end of one of Bartholomew Cruz's quiet, careful campaigns. She poured Marlena a cup of tea. She listened to the description of Pruitt's visit and to the citation of the Preemption Act. She read the notice that Marlena had brought with her. She looked at Marlena over the rim of her teacup. This is not the man Cruz will send next. I know. He is testing the ground. He wants to know what you will do. I am going to fight it. Yes, but you are not going to fight it alone. She set down the teacup. There is a young lawyer in this town named Ansel Doyle. He is 28 years old. He passed the bar last year. He is the son of a tenant farmer from Odo County, and he has more intelligence than the 3 senior partners of the largest firm in Plattsmouth put together, and he is currently unable to get the kind of clients he deserves because the senior firms in this town have closed ranks against him. I retain him on a small monthly stipend for advice on my own affairs. I am going to introduce you to him tomorrow. He is going to take this notice apart so completely that whoever sent it will wish they had sent something else. Marlena nodded. There is one more thing, Theodora said. Yes. When Mr. Doyle examines the original filing in the records office, I want him to look very carefully at the signature line. Very carefully. I have a feeling about what he may find. Marlena looked at her. You think they tampered with it? I think Bartholomew Cruz has never lost a fight in his life by playing only the cards that everyone else knew he was holding. The 2 women looked at each other across the small table in the warm afternoon light of the parlor. Marlena set down her teacup. Then we will look at the signature. Theodora Blackwood almost smiled. Almost. Ansel Doyle was 28 years old, and he kept his small law office in 2 rented rooms above the harness shop on 5th Street in Plattsmouth. And when Marlena Thatcher walked up the narrow wooden staircase behind Theodora Blackwood on the morning of May 15th, 1885, she found a young man at a desk in shirt sleeves with 3 open law books in front of him, and the careful, focused expression of a person who had been waiting for the kind of case that would let him know what he could do. When the 2 women entered, he shook Marlena's hand with the firm, respectful grip of a young lawyer who had been raised by a tenant farmer father to understand that a handshake was the first sentence of the conversation, and he gestured to the 2 wooden chairs across from his desk, and he sat down across from them and folded his hands on the desk and waited for Theodora to speak. Theodora spoke for less than 2 minutes. She laid out the situation in the careful, efficient summary of a woman who had been married to a judge for 30 years and who knew exactly which facts a lawyer needed to begin his work. Ansel Doyle listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he turned to Marlena and asked her 3 questions. He asked whether she had a copy of the original patent application. She said she did. She had kept a clerical copy that Mercer had initialed and given to her on the afternoon she filed. He asked whether she would consent to him examining the original on file at the county records office with her formal written authorization. She said she would. She produced the leather wallet from her bag and showed him the clerical copy. He asked whether she had observed anything unusual about Royden Pike's behavior on the day of filing or in any subsequent encounters. She thought for a moment. She told him that Pike had been in the back office on the afternoon she filed, and that he had not come out, and that she had not met him until 2 weeks later in town, when he had introduced himself in the way a person introduces themselves when they are observing something. She told him about the conversation between Pike and the Reverend Quill that she had subsequently learned about from a woman in the church who had been at the boarding house that night, and she told him that she had made an entry about it in her ledger. Doyle nodded slowly. He took out a sheet of paper. He wrote down her authorization for him to examine the original filing. She signed it. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said. "Yes. This notice is going to be the easiest part of this. The preemption citation is so obviously wrong that any first-year clerk could refute it. I will have it dismissed within 10 days. Good. What concerns me, and what concerns Mrs. Blackwood, is what we may find in the original filing when I examine it tomorrow morning. If there is what we suspect there is, then we are no longer dealing with a procedural error. We are dealing with forgery, and we are dealing with the cooperation of a county clerk in that forgery, and we are dealing with whoever paid that clerk to commit it." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand, Mrs. Thatcher, that if I find evidence of tampering tomorrow, you will have a choice to make. You can prosecute. You can take the evidence to the United States District Court in Lincoln and file federal charges against Royden Pike and against whoever paid him, and you will likely win, and you will likely destroy the careers and the fortunes of both men in the process. Or you can hold the evidence. You can keep it in reserve. You can use it as leverage to ensure that the man behind this never bothers you again without ever filing public charges against him." He paused. "I will follow your instruction in either direction. I want you to think about which you prefer before you tell me." Marlena looked at him. She looked at Theodora. She thought, "I will tell you tomorrow afternoon after you have seen the document." "That is the right answer." She rose. She shook his hand again. She walked out of the office with Theodora behind her, and the two women descended the narrow staircase and stood on the wooden sidewalk of 5th Street in the warm morning light. And Theodora said quietly that she had not seen a young man like that in Plattsmouth in 15 years. Ansel Doyle examined the original patent application at the Cass County Land Office on the morning of May 16, 1885, in the presence of Silas Mercer and a notary public named Wendell Pruitt, who was Harlan Pruitt's older brother, and who had no idea what his sibling had been involved in. Doyle had requested the notary specifically to ensure that whatever he found in the document would be witnessed and recorded. He found it. The signature line bore the unmistakable marks of a scratched-out original underneath a second signature, written in a hand that approximated Marlena Thatcher's, but did not match it. Under the magnifying glass that Doyle had brought with him, the scratched-out original was still partially legible. It was Marlena's actual signature, the careful, upright hand she had used for 30 years, now defaced and overwritten with a passable but not identical forgery. The notary recorded what he had observed. He signed the record. He stamped it. Silas Mercer stood in the records room with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who had just realized that something he had been suspecting for almost a year had now been proven, and that he was going to have to decide what kind of man he was going to be from this point forward. Doyle thanked Mercer. He thanked the notary. He took the notarized record back to his office. He sat at his desk for a long while after he returned, holding the document in his hands, and he understood that he was now in possession of evidence that could end the public life of Bartholomew Cruz and the employment and probable freedom of Royden Pike. And he understood also that his client had not yet told him what she wanted done with it. He waited. Marlena came at 3 in the afternoon. She read the notary's record. She set it down on the desk. She looked at Ansel Doyle. "Mr. Doyle?" "Yes. I want you to dismiss the notice from the county. I want that done publicly and on the record, so that everyone in Plattsmouth knows that the procedural challenge was without merit. That will be done by Monday. I want this notarized record to be kept in your safe. It is in my safe already. I want a sealed copy to be kept in Mrs. Blackwood's safe as well. That will be arranged this afternoon. I will hold this evidence. I understand. There will be a day. I do not know when. There will be a day when Mr. Cruz comes to my door himself. He will not send a clerk, and he will not send a lawyer. He will come himself because he is the kind of man who eventually does. On that day, I will choose whether to lay this evidence on my kitchen table or whether to let him leave my property without ever knowing it exists." Doyle looked at her. "That is the right answer to the question I asked you yesterday." "I know." He nodded slowly. He stood. He shook her hand. He walked her to the door. The notice from the county was formally dismissed on Monday morning by the county attorney's office on the explicit grounds that the cited statute did not apply to the Homestead Act of 1862, and that the original patent issued to Marlena Thatcher was valid in all respects. The dismissal was published in the Plattsmouth Herald on Tuesday. Royden Pike read it at his desk in the records office, and he understood that something had gone wrong with the plan he had been paid $40 to participate in. But he did not understand the full extent of what had gone wrong, because Ansel Doyle had not made public the discovery of the forgery, and had not filed charges, and had not so much as mentioned the original document in his correspondence with the county attorney's office. Pike thought he had escaped. He had not. Bartholomew Cruz read the Tuesday paper at his breakfast table. He set it down. He sat for a long while with his coffee cooling in front of him. He understood the way men of his experience understand these things, that he had lost the procedural challenge, and that the loss was not because of any error in the planning, but because the widow had retained better counsel than he had expected her to be able to retain. He did not yet know about the forgery being discovered. He assumed, because Doyle had said nothing, that the matter had been resolved on the statutory grounds alone. He gave instructions. He sent for a man named Wade Easter, who did a particular kind of work for Cruz that did not appear in any of the formal ledgers of the Cruz business operations, and who lived in a small house on the south edge of Plattsmouth that Cruz owned and that Easter occupied rent-free in exchange for his services. Easter was 34 years old. He was a quiet, competent man with no family and no particular convictions, and a willingness to do whatever Cruz asked of him. The summer of 1885 passed in the steady accumulation of the second year's work. Marlena expanded her truck garden. She added bell peppers and sweet potato to the rotation. She put in an experimental plot of Tennessee heritage tobacco that produced a crop the buyer in St. Joseph took at premium price. The corn came in at 47 bushels to the acre. The dairy expanded to 4 cows. Eli grew 2 inches over the summer and started carrying loads that 2 years earlier his mother had carried alone. The first crisis of the year came in the second week of August. A heavy thunderstorm rolled through the basin on a Tuesday afternoon with high winds that took down a stand of old cottonwoods at the southwest corner of the property. And Eli was helping Calloway clear the deadfall on Wednesday morning, when one of the larger limbs shifted unexpectedly under his foot, and his lower leg went into the gap between 2 trunks at an angle that no leg is designed to bend. The bone snapped clean. Calloway carried him to the cabin. Marlena sent the wagon to town for the doctor. The doctor came. He set the leg. He said the boy would be off it for 6 weeks at minimum. Marlena ran the farm for 6 weeks with only Calloway to help her. She did not falter. She did not weep except once in private on the second night after Eli had finally fallen asleep against the laudanum, and she had walked out to the channels in the dark and stood for a long time with her hand against the rough bark of a willow she had planted the previous spring, and she had let 1 minute pass in which she allowed herself to feel the full weight of being 39 years old and alone in Nebraska with a broken sun and a hostile county and an enemy whose face she had not yet seen. 1 minute. Then she had walked back to the cabin, and she had not let herself feel that again. On the third night after the accident, Wade Easter came to the basin. He came at 2 a.m. He moved across the open prairie from the south on foot, in dark clothing, with a small unlit lantern in one hand and a bottle of kerosene in his coat. He had been at the property twice before in daylight, on errands that allowed him to learn its layout. He knew where the barn was. He knew where the cabin was. He knew that Marlena Thatcher's 2 new draft horses and her 4 milk cows were stalled in the barn at night. And he knew that the barn was where the corn and the hay and the cured tobacco were stored. And he knew that the loss of the barn at this point in the season would set the operation back by a full year at minimum and possibly destroy it outright. He approached the barn from the south. He lit the lantern in the shelter of the south wall. He poured kerosene along the dry boards of the lower siding. He set the lantern against the wet boards and tipped it. The flame took. The fire began to climb the south wall of the barn at 22 minutes after 2 a.m. What Wade Easter had not accounted for was that one of Marlena's channels ran within 15 feet of the barn's south wall. and that the channel was currently carrying a steady flow of water from the creek, and that the channel was wide enough and deep enough that Marlena Thatcher, when she came out of the cabin at the smell of smoke at 24 minutes after 2, had only to grab a tin bucket from the porch, and the fight was within reach. Calloway came out of the small bunkhouse he had built that spring. The two of them worked the fire for almost 20 minutes. They beat it back with water from the channel and with shovels of wet earth from the channel banks, and the barn was scorched and damaged on the south wall. But the structure held, and the animals inside were unharmed, and the stored crop did not catch. When the fire was out, Marlena stood in the dark, in the smell of wet smoke and burned wood, and she walked the south side of the barn with the lantern, and she looked at the ground. She found the footprints. She followed them out from the wall across the trampled earth to a place where Wade Easter had crouched briefly to relight the lantern after his initial attempt to set the fire. The crouch had pressed his boots deep into the soft mud of the channel bank. The boots had a particular tread pattern. The boots had a small distinguishing mark at the heel of the right boot, a triangular notch where the leather had been repaired with a brass-headed nail. Marlena knelt in the lantern light. She studied the print. She stood. She walked back to the cabin, and she went to her ledger, and she made a careful drawing of the print and of the heel mark, and beneath it she wrote the date and the time and the description of what had happened. She closed the ledger. She slept 3 hours. In the morning, she sent Calloway to town for the sheriff. The sheriff came. He looked at the burn marks on the barn. He looked at the prints which were still preserved in the mud where Marlena had marked them with stakes. He took notes. He said he would investigate. He did not investigate. The sheriff was a man named Edgar Stein, who owed Bartholomew Cruz a great deal of money on a series of personal loans, and who was not in a position to investigate anything that touched Cruz's circle. Marlena had expected this. 3 days later, she drove the wagon into Plattsmouth, and she went to the small bootmaker's shop on Vine Street that was run by an elderly German named Oscar Hoffman, who was the only bootmaker in town who did the kind of brass nail heel repair that the print at her barn had shown. Hoffman was 70 years old, and he kept careful records of every repair he had ever done in 3 thick ledgers that lined the back wall of his shop. She showed him her drawing. She described the repair. Hoffman looked at the drawing. He looked at her. He went to the second ledger. He turned to the entries from the previous autumn. He ran his finger down the column. "This boot," he said, "I repaired in October of last year." "Whose boot?" He hesitated. "Mrs. Thatcher." "Whose boot?" "It is not my business to involve myself in, Mr. Hoffman." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the ledger. "Wade Easter," he said quietly. "He works for Mr. Cruz." She nodded. She thanked him. She did not tell him to keep the conversation private. She did not need to. Oscar Hoffman was the kind of man who understood without being told. She walked out of his shop. She walked back to her wagon. She drove home. She did not go to the sheriff. She did not go to Ansel Doyle. She went to her ledger that night, and she wrote down what Hoffman had told her, and she added the entry to the file that already contained the description of the kerosene at the original well, and the notarized record of the forged signature, and the drawing of the boot print at the barn. The file was now thick enough to matter. She set it aside. She continued the harvest. The autumn of 1885 brought the second full harvest at the basin, and the numbers were stronger than the first year's. The corn came in at 47 bushels to the acre. The truck garden delivered to Otto Bergstrom and to the Omaha grocer through the end of October. The tobacco crop sold at premium. Eli's leg healed clean, and he was walking without a limp by the first week of October. The fourth-year mortgage on the wagon was paid off in November. The basin was by every measurable standard a working farm of the kind that her husband Jeremiah had projected on the back page of his journal. The winter passed quietly. The spring of 1886 came on schedule. What did not come in the second week of June was the rain. The first sign that something was wrong with the weather came on the 11th of June, when the storm system that should have moved through Cass County from the southwest at the regular interval simply did not arrive. The sky was clear. The wind shifted slightly to the southeast and held. By the 18th, the second expected system had also failed to arrive. By the 25th, the third. By the end of June, the rain that should have totaled 4 inches across the month had totaled less than half an inch, and the prairie had begun to take on the particular suppressed alarm that farming communities wear when the sky has not been performing as expected. July was worse. The rains that should have come in the first week did not come. The rains that should have come in the second week did not come. The temperature climbed into the upper 90s for 3 consecutive days in mid-July, and the prairie wind picked up out of the southwest and dried the upland soil in a way that no upland soil in Cass County had been dried in 11 years. Wells dropped. Creeks reduced to trickles and then to dry beds. Garrick Brindle lost a third of his corn crop by the end of July. Cyrus Holt lost 60%. A farmer named Royden Pike, no relation to the records clerk who had purchased upland ground in the 1880 spring opening, and who had told anyone who would listen that the Hungarian-style channels the Tennessee widow had cut were not real agriculture, watched his crop fail so completely that by the 1st of August, he was negotiating with the bank in Plattsmouth for an emergency loan against his title. The basin held. The corn at Platte 47 stood dark and tall through July. The channels carried less water than they had in a normal year, but they carried enough because the creek continued to flow at perhaps a quarter of its normal volume, and because the basin's soil was holding the moisture it had received in the previous wet seasons and releasing it slowly upward into the root zone in the exact pattern that Jeremiah Thatcher had predicted in his notes 7 years earlier. The truck garden produced through the drought because Marlena's deeper well kept the small additional irrigation she occasionally provided the most sensitive plants reliable. The dairy cows continued to milk because the basin pasture stayed green when the upland pastures went dormant. The numbers in her ledger were steady. The numbers in every other ledger in Cass County were collapsing. On the 8th of August, in the 8th week of the drought, Bartholomew Cruz drove his buggy out to the basin alone. He came in the early morning before the heat. He arrived at the cabin at 20 minutes past 7. Marlena was at the table eating breakfast with Eli. She saw the buggy approach. She set down her coffee. She told Eli to take his plate out to the back porch and to stay there until she called for him. Eli looked at his mother. He understood. He took his plate and went out the back door. Marlena opened the front door before Cruz knocked. He removed his hat. "Mrs. Thatcher." "Mr. Cruz? I would be obliged for a few minutes of your time." "Step inside." She offered him a chair at her kitchen table. She poured him a cup of coffee. He thanked her. He set his hat on the table beside him. He was 59 years old now, in the heat of the worst summer in a decade, and he carried his 59 years with the careful, upright posture of a man who had built his life on the discipline of appearance. And he sat at her table with the same posture he would have used at the table of the territorial governor. "Mrs. Thatcher?" "Yes. I will not waste your time with preliminaries. I have come to make you an offer for your parcel." "I expected you would." "I am prepared to pay you 5 times your filing fee in cash today for the patent on Plat 47. That is, as you understand, a considerable sum. It would allow you to relocate to better ground at substantial scale, or to return to Tennessee, or to do whatever else you might wish to do with the proceeds." Marlena listened. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she sat for a long moment without speaking. She rose from her chair. She walked to the small wooden cabinet at the back of the cabin where she kept her ledger and her papers. She unlocked it with a small key she kept on a chain around her neck. She withdrew 3 items. She returned to the table. She placed the first item on the table between them. It was the notarized record of the forged signature signed by Wendell Pruitt and dated May 16, 1885, with the magnifying observation of the scratched-out original beneath the substituted signature recorded in the notary's careful hand. Cruz looked at the document. His face did not change, but his eyes did. She placed the second item on the table. It was her ledger drawing of the boot print at the barn with the brass nail heel notch carefully recorded, and beneath it, her notation of the date and the time, August 14th, 1885, 2:24 in the morning. Attached to the drawing was a brief signed statement from Oscar Hoffman, the bootmaker on Vine Street, confirming that the repair pattern in the print matched a boot he had repaired for Wade Easter in October of 1884, and that Wade Easter was known to be in the regular employ of Mr. Bartholomew Cruz. Cruz looked at the document. His face did not change. His eyes did. She placed the third item on the table. It was a short typed letter from Ansel Doyle, prepared the previous week at her request, indicating that sealed copies of the notarized record and of Hoffman's statement were currently held in his office safe and in the safe of Mrs. Theodora Blackwood, and that Mr. Doyle had standing instructions to deliver both sealed copies to the United States District Attorney in Lincoln in the event that any harm or further legal harassment befell Marlena Thatcher or her son Eli, or in the event that Mr. Doyle did not receive a brief monthly letter from her confirming her well-being. Cruz looked at all 3 documents. He looked at them for almost a full minute. The kitchen was very quiet. The only sound was the slow tick of the small clock on the mantel and the distant call of a meadowlark somewhere out in the basin. Marlena spoke. "Mr. Cruz." He looked at her. "I am not going to sell you this parcel. I am not going to sell it to you this year. I am not going to sell it to you next year. I am not going to sell it to you when I am 80. My son Eli will not sell it to you when I am dead. The basin you wanted for your bypass is not available to you, and it will never be available to you, and the rail company will in the end find another crossing, because the rail company always does when the ground it wanted is not for sale." She paused. "I am also not going to file these documents with the district attorney in Lincoln. I am not going to file them today. I am not going to file them next month. I am going to keep them in the cabinet at the back of this cabin, and Mr. Doyle is going to keep his copies in his safe, and Mrs. Blackwood is going to keep her copies in hers. And we are all 3 going to keep them for the rest of our lives, on the single condition that you walk out of this cabin in the next 2 minutes and never come within sight of my property or my son or me again. You will not send messengers. You will not send clerks. You will not send Wade Easter. If anything irregular happens to me or to Eli or to this farm in the next 40 years, these documents go to Lincoln in the same afternoon. Do I make myself clear?" Bartholomew Cruz looked at her. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at her again. He picked up his hat. He stood. "Mrs. Thatcher, yes, you have made yourself clear. Good." He paused at the door. He did not turn around. "I underestimated you." "Yes." He opened the door. He walked to his buggy. He drove away. Marlena stood at the open door and watched him go. When the buggy was out of sight, she gathered the 3 documents from the table, returned them to the cabinet, locked it, and put the key back on the chain around her neck. She walked to the back porch where Eli was sitting with his plate. The boy looked up at her. "Mother." "Yes." "Is it done?" "It is done." He looked at her for a long moment. "All of it. All of it that we can finish today." He nodded. He went back to his breakfast. The rain came on the 4th of August, 1886 in a thunderstorm that moved across Cass County from the northwest in the late afternoon, and that delivered 2.5 inches of water across 3 hours. The basin received the storm the way the basin received every storm, with the unhurried efficiency of a system designed to absorb rather than shed, and the channels filled, and the field beds drank, and the cracked earth of the depression at the basin center took up its first significant moisture in 8 weeks, and began the slow process of replenishing the underground account that had carried the farm through the drought. The harvest of 1886 was the harvest that ended any remaining argument in Cass County about the Basin Farm. The county corn yield collapsed to 11 bushels to the acre, the worst in the decade. Marlena Thatcher's basin produced 38. The truck garden produced through the drought at rates that overwhelmed the local market and required shipment to Omaha and Lincoln. The dairy operation cleared $320 across the summer. The county fair was held in the second week of September, and Marlena entered 11 categories and placed first in 7. Linus Crane, the young extension agent from Lincoln who had walked the basin 2 years earlier and written the bulletin describing her channel system, stood at the podium during the awards ceremony and read a brief formal statement from the University of Nebraska Extension Service, formally recognizing Marlena Thatcher's Basin Farm as one of the model agricultural operations of the eastern Nebraska region. He named the channel system. He named the principle of distribution over drainage. He named her. In the back row of the audience, Bartholomew Cruz sat with his hat in his hands. He did not applaud. He did not look at the stage. He had aged 10 years in 3 months. The rail company, finding no available crossing through the basin he had spent 8 months acquiring options on, had altered the bypass route through a different township and had canceled the option on the secondary parcels he had purchased in anticipation of the original line. The cancellation had cost him $11,000 in unrecoverable investment. The investors he had brought into the project had withdrawn their commitments to 2 of his other ventures. The slow, careful machinery of his fortune, which had been built across 35 years on a foundation of patient information and trusted alliances, had developed a crack that ran through several of its load-bearing components. He did not look at the stage when Marlena's name was read. She did not look at him. Royden Pike, the records clerk, had been quietly dismissed from his position at the county land office in July on the official explanation that the office was being reorganized and that his position was being eliminated. He had taken work as a junior clerk for a livestock auction house in Nebraska City at a substantial reduction in salary, and he no longer lived in Platt's Mouth. Garrick Brindle came to the basin door on a Saturday afternoon in late October. He sat at Marlena's kitchen table for 2 hours. She walked him through the channel system. She drew him a diagram on a piece of butcher paper. She explained the principle of capture and distribution and recharge. She told him honestly that his ridge ground would never produce what her basin produced, but that he could improve it substantially by building the organic layer he did not have, and by installing a small cistern to capture roof runoff, and by paying close attention to the micro-topography of his lower fields, where small basins of his own might be developed at modest scale. Brindle listened. He took notes. He asked good questions. She told him everything. He thanked her. He rode home. In the autumn of 1887, the county assessor's office sent out reassessment notices. Plat 47 had increased in assessed value by 61%. The surrounding ridge parcels had increased by an average of 14%. The basin was now appraised at $720. The filing fee had been $30. Theodora Blackwood died in the autumn of 1889 of a sudden heart failure on a quiet morning in her parlor on Pearl Street. She was 63 years old. She had spent the last 3 years of her life as Marlena's closest friend in Cass County, riding out to the basin once a month for tea and conversation.
And Marlena had ridden into Plattsmouth twice a month for the same purpose. Theodora's funeral was on the 14th of October in the small Methodist church on Pine Street, and the Reverend Linus Quill, who had become in his later years an unexpected ally of Marlena's after the events of the first summer, delivered the eulogy.
3 weeks after the funeral, Marlena received a sealed envelope by post from the law office of Ansel Doyle. Doyle had been retained as the executor of Theodora Blackwood's estate. The envelope, the cover letter explained, had been left in Mrs. Blackwood's safe with explicit instructions that it be delivered to Marlena Thatcher only upon Mrs. Blackwood's death, and only with the accompanying letter Mr. Doyle had now enclosed. Marlena opened the cover letter at her kitchen table. She read it. Mr. Doyle had written that the enclosed sealed envelope had been in Mrs. Blackwood's possession for nearly 8 years, and that Mrs. Blackwood had received it by post from a man named Caleb Worth of Sevier County, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1881, with instructions to deliver it under specific circumstances that Mrs. Blackwood had judged in the events of the spring of 1884 to have been met. Caleb Worth, Marlena's father. She set down the cover letter. She picked up the sealed envelope. She opened it with the small knife she kept on her writing table. Inside the envelope was a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting on the paper was her husband Jeremiah's. She read it slowly with her hand pressed flat against the table to keep the paper steady, while the afternoon light moved across the cabin floor and the small clock on the mantel ticked the quiet seconds of an October Tuesday in 1889. My dearest Marlena, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the basin in Cass County has held you and Eli the way I believed it would. Your father has written to a woman named Theodora Blackwood in Plattsmouth, whose late husband, Judge Owen Blackwood, was a friend of mine through correspondence during my surveying years. I have asked Mrs. Blackwood to find you when you come, and to be useful to you in whatever way she can without your knowing why. She is a woman of great character. You can trust her with anything. I did not want you to feel alone in a country that would feel very large to you in the first years. I could not be there. I could not walk those channels with you the way we walked them in our minds together in the autumn before the cough took hold. But your father and I arranged what we could from this distance.
You were not alone, Marlena. Not in the first year. Not in any of the years. The ground always knew what it was worth. You were the one I trusted to listen to it. Yours was
Jeremiah. Marlena held the letter for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the cabin. She did not weep. She had wept already in the basin in the dark, on the night after Eli broke his leg, and in the privacy of her bed, on the night Theodora was buried, and in a few other small private moments across the 5 years she had lived on Plat 47. The weeping in this moment was not what the moment required. What the moment required was the steady, careful attention she had been trained to give to important documents her entire life, and she gave it to the letter, and she read it 3 times more, and she folded it carefully along its original creases, and she returned it to the envelope, and she rose from the table and walked to the cabinet at the back of the cabin and unlocked it with the small key from the chain around her neck, and she placed the envelope inside, beside her husband's journal and her own ledger, and the file containing the documents that had once held Bartholomew Cruz accountable across a kitchen table. She closed the cabinet. She locked it. She returned the key to the chain around her neck. She walked outside. Eli was at the south fence repairing a section of rail that the autumn wind had loosened. He was 17 years old now, taller than she was by a head, with his father's careful hands and his father's quiet thoroughness, and a small new habit of humming under his breath. When he worked a habit he had picked up that summer from Calloway, who had stayed on as foreman and was building a small cabin of his own at the southeast corner of the property, where he intended in the spring to bring a young wife from Burt County. The basin spread out around them in the last afternoon light of an October Tuesday. The channels she had cut in her first April were now 5 years old, and they had settled into permanent form, and the grass at their edges was the deep, saturated green of vegetation that had access to moisture other vegetation could only dream about. The corn had been harvested 3 weeks earlier, and the stubble stood in neat rows across the field beds. The dairy cows were in the pasture at the eastern edge. The barn, repaired and expanded since the night of the fire, stood solid and white-painted in the soft light. The small cabin where she lived with Eli, where she had eaten 10,000 meals and slept 1,500 nights, and written 5 years of ledger entries, sat on the slightly elevated northern rise with the lamplight beginning to show in the kitchen window, where Calloway's wife-to-be was visiting for the week, and had started the supper that the 3 of them would share that evening. She had chosen the piece of land nobody wanted. She had done it with her eyes open and her knowledge intact, and her husband's tools in the trunk, and a clear understanding of what she was choosing and why. She had done it with a map drawn by a man who had walked this ground in the autumn before he died, and with the help of a woman who had been placed in her path by a father's careful letter sent across half a continent in 1881. She had done it against the patient, careful campaign of a man who had built his fortune on the assumption that women alone could not hold what they had filed on, and she had ended that man's interest in her ground by laying 3 documents on a kitchen table in the 8th week of a drought. The ground had always known what it was worth. She had simply been one of the people standing on it who knew how to listen. She walked down the slope toward the fence where her son was working. The light was beginning to soften. Supper would be ready soon. If this story of a Tennessee widow who chose the land nobody wanted and made it the most productive ground in Cass County reached something useful in you, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There are more documented accounts of the kind of practical wisdom that gets dismissed before it gets vindicated, and the kind of quiet courage that builds a life across 5 hard seasons against the patient resistance of men who believed they understood the ground better than the woman who actually did. We'll keep bringing these stories as long as you keep watching.